All right. Good morning or good evening to everyone on the call. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Adam, who's presenting to us today. I know it's starting to get late in the evenings, Adam, so thank you very much for your time. Today, we have a very exciting presentation from Adam Bowery, who's a lead research engineer at the Fire Safety Research Institute, which is part of UL in the United States. And I'm sure Adam will provide a brief description of what FSRI do. So I believe Adam has 9 years commercial experience prior to joining FSRI. And Adam worked to develop different UL standards and test methods, looking at different fire hazards and innovative fire protected solutions. Um, Adam's particular research interest, I believe, is characterizing thermal and fire explosion hazards in energy storage systems, which he'll be presenting on today. And prior to working at UL, Adam worked at NIST, conducting full-scale structural fire field experiments to enable improved firefighter tactics and looking at different firefight equipment. So I'd like to thank Adam very much for joining us over from the East Coast of the US, I believe. And the floor is yours, Adam. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much, Josh. Just to confirm one more time, you can see my screen and laser pointer.
Yes.
Okay, great. I have, yeah, of course, more slides than there's time because there's a lot of work we've done here, and it's all pretty exciting. So, since you all are students, I'm going to assume, is anyone, I don't know if I can go open the chat window or anything. Is there much familiarity with thermal runaway with lithium-ion batteries, or should we kind of start from square one? So let me go
There
to
should
the,
be a mix of students and also practitioners in the industry. So
oh,
I'm assuming they may have some knowledge of this, but also I'm not sure how advanced it is. So feel free to
okay.
take it whatever way you want.
Yep, absolutely. Okay. We'll go with the kind of quicker pace through more slides then. But Yeah, so let me get my laser pointer back. um, yeah, so FSRI, if this obeys me, hang on, there we go. Uh, we started with uh, basically being the Firefighter Safety Research Institute, and what tends to happen when you work for a big company and you don't screw up is they give you more work. So they've widened our scope, and the fire service is certainly at the center of what we do, but they're not our only stakeholder. So our research now is a bit more like NIST was in the 80s and 90s, where we're serving a very wide stakeholder group. We're involving a lot more work that will benefit the fire safety community in terms of authorities having jurisdictions, codes and standards, fire protection engineers in terms of knowledge that we're outputting. So that's why we have this kind of open-ended mission statement of we're dedicated to addressing the world's unresolved fire safety risks and emerging dangers. And if I stumble over my speech too much at all, it is kind of late here. Yeah. So our research priority areas, we're probably most well known for people that know us for doing our firefighter health and safety work. That's where all the senior staff pretty much all got our start working for Dan Madrzykowski at NIST 15 to 20 years ago. And so we studied the movement of fire through structures in support of developing a better understanding of fire dynamics to help firefighters fight fires more effectively and safely. We've always been pretty heavily involved in fire modeling, but we have some of the developers of FDS on our staff now. So Jason Floyd, Craig Weinshank, and a couple of others. And so we continue to develop or do research that helps to develop FDS. We have a materials database as well. If you are in school and doing modeling, you may end up pulling FDS or other model inputs from our page. If you're not familiar, I would recommend you get familiar with that page because you'll find a lot of useful information there. And that's a live database that will continue to update. So that comes off our endowed funds. So there is no like government source of funding for that. That is expected to live for as long as the company lives. So that's kind of nice to know. Wild and urban interface is an area probably of greatest growth for us. I know Steve Kerber was over in Australia a couple, maybe half a year ago or so, talking on the subject. But we have Gavin Horn and Joe Willie leading this area. And essentially, I think probably the highest profile things we've done are the analysis of the fires that occurred in Maui and now more recently the Palisades fire in California. So looking for reasons why those fires were as bad as they were and doing research to recommend improvements to our infrastructure so that we lessen the severity of fire spread through neighborhoods. Battery fire safety, we're going to talk about that all night. So I'll skip that. That's my research area with the team I work with. And then data science and NERIS. That is one team that's probably our largest team now. And so there's about 20 full-time staff dedicated to developing the National Emergency Response Information System, which is going to allow us to see incidents roll in as firefighters come back from calls and report them into the system. So we have a system in the United States. It'll be sunset at the end of this year. It's old, was developed in the 70s, and doesn't capture data in the way that we need or expect in 2025. So this will be a massive overhaul of the US reporting system. And so Craig Weinschenk is actually leading that as well. This is just a quick snapshot of my team. They are phenomenal. I think I have the most international team. So we get that award, but everyone's quite versatile, but we all now specialize in battery fire safety. Just a quick buzz through what we're doing right now. So if you like what I show you tonight and you want to keep your eyes peeled for anything else in batteries that might be of relevance to you, probably our most well-known project is this one on studying EV fires. So we're looking at changes in thermal hazards with vehicle fires, how chemical exposure hazards are changing with transition to batteries, and what firefighters can do in terms of strategy, decision aids, and particular tactics to try to manage those somewhat more stubborn fires more easily. We also developed a measurement technology. I just want to show off this cool video that this is Matt DiDomizio and Barham Dagani put this together. So we have a Tesla burning, and the battery pack was jetting out of the wheel well. So this analysis is actually a video overlay of data measured by thermal imaging cameras. And that let us do a two-dimensional heat flux map. So that instrument is something that we've published on, and we're hoping to see more in the fire research industry, is use of this two-dimensional heat flux sensor for developing field data rather than point data like in the past. I will circle back to e-mobility fire impact on passenger railcar tenability at the end, since we're talking about fire environments. A little bit is on safe movement of damaged batteries down the road and the explosion hazards that can create. And then the last couple I'll buzz through here. We ran some research in the desert with Sandia National Labs, basically for us to develop guidance on where to place instrumentation if you're going to perform an explosion test. This is a kind of a burgeoning field of ESS safety evaluation. And so there's really no guidance on where do you put things and how do you make measurements and how do you evaluate it. So we've conducted some research with some fairly large explosions to provide that guidance. Other people do that research, but they don't tend to share that particular type of information. So we're wanting to get that out. This video here is just showing you that yes, you can explode a flammable liquid storage cabinet, and that's important. You'll find out why tonight, because if you paint it from yellow to blue or green and call it a eco-green safe energy storage box for putting your e-bike batteries in, all you've really done is repaint it. You haven't made it safer. So that test was for us to demonstrate that the doors need to either self-close or be deflagration resistant for storing batteries inside. And the last thing is we do PSAs. So we tend to take the research we've run and put together public safety announcements from our findings, because the public is an essential part of fire safety strategy in reducing their own risk and the risks of each other. So, and we can come back to that sort of at the end with railcar research as well. So what I wanted to make sure that you all can do is understand the construction of batteries, the reasons why they might fail and go into thermal runaway, and how fire and explosion hazards develop from those thermal runaways. And then I've put together a resource to just basically ask, perform as like step one. If you're looking at a battery engineering challenge or lab safety issue, you can use this resource to kind of just map things out. All the real work happens after that, but this is just to understand what's possible, in some situation that you're looking to engineer the hazards out of. So we don't really need to talk about one particular type of batteries. A lot of what we're trying to do at FSRI is boil things down to the fundamentals because we're seeing battery fires in cars, cell phones in beds, laptops on planes, e-bikes in high-rise apartments, but they're really all driven by the same fundamental development of hazards. Um, so we tend to see now incidents all over the world every day, and we need things like NERIS, the National Emergency Response Information System, for us to be able to track where those incidents are happening, with what, and what the consequences are. So it's easy for me to wormhole and talk about any one of those other exciting topics. So I'll turn back to battery construction or cell construction. If you like what you have here, this link here will actually take you to our course we put together. It's free. It costs only just your email, so we can, have like a little count so we know how popular the course is. So this is all funded, internally by us as well. But I'm going to shave off just a portion that fits within tonight. But the course normally runs like an hour and a half if you're sitting at your computer, and it goes into a lot of the same detail. So regardless of what a battery is, if it's lithium ion, regardless what it's in, it's almost certainly, there may be some edge cases, but it's almost certainly this layout. There's a few shapes, kind of flexible foil pouches, not too flexible, but, not a rigid plastic or metal case. There is prismatic, which tends to be square, so plastic or metal cases, and cylindrical cells, which almost everyone is probably familiar with at this point. The things that used to be in laptops, they're in e-cigarettes often. They're cheap and easy to buy. They're great for like flashlights. So these are in a lot of consumer products. Prismatic tend to be in things like European EVs or energy storage systems. Pouch are just really the most open-ended design. So I think I probably am looking at one in my watch right now. You can make them any form factor, size, shape, whatever. But they're all basically built of four types of components. And it's the same type that make most batteries go. So there's a cathode and anode. You have to have those things. And then you have a separator between the cathode and anode. So what you look at in any of these, and pouch is probably the easiest to look at, is you have a layer of cathode, then a separator, and a layer of anode. And that just repeats in a stack. The separator's job is to prevent electrical communication between the cathode and anode, otherwise known as a short or a spark or an arc, where you're going to have electrical discharge. And then you have something called the electrolyte. So the electrolyte is typically hydrocarbon mixtures, really big molecules like dimethyl carbonate, ethyl methyl carbonate. There's a few others that are popular, and they're not in a liquid form. They're just kind of sponged in there. And what that allows the battery to do is to communicate lithium ions back and forth between the cathode and anode. And that's what makes the battery go. When a lithium ion goes from a charged surface to an uncharged surface, moves back and forth between the cathode and anode, an electron will go through the tabs of the battery. That's what creates your current. That's what makes the battery go. So the metal oxide is combustible. The plastics are combustible. Sometimes the anode is somewhat combustible, and the electrolytes are combustible. So at rest, at 0% state of charge with no energy in this battery, you have some amount of flammability with the components here. There can be other features that can be sort of important. We don't really need to worry about them today. Things like fuses so that you can't overcharge battery. That's a source of failure. Vents so that if gas pressure builds up inside, it can pop and the gas pressure can be released. All of those are individual features that have reduced the frequency of thermal runaway, but let's operate for fire safety under the assumption that thermal runaway is almost certainly going to happen, because the industry's been talking about eliminating it for 5 to 7 years, and I've been doing this for 10, and we're still 5 to 7 years away. So that's kind of it will happen eventually. I have confidence the engineers will do their work in the battery industry, but until then, we'll be engineering out the fire safety hazards. I'm skipping through a lot here. There are basically in a cell at when it's charged is a stable system of stored energy, and you can do a number of things to destabilize that stored energy. We're mostly going to talk about heat tonight, but if you're familiar with Samsung Galaxy Note 7, these types of issues, multiple of those issues, misalignment, contamination, things that lead to that separator not being where it needs to be, or the separator being damaged, or otherwise an electrical communication or short circuit inside the cell led to those failures. We've probably all seen enough YouTube videos to know that mechanical is probably the most well known. Like someone's got the phone in their pocket and they fall down some stairs. Um, we know that that can cause thermal runaway. Little less understood in the public are things called dendrites, which is essentially a deposits forming inside the battery that make like a sort of a stalagmite that pokes through the separator and causes electrical communication. And then, of course, things like overcharge is probably one of the big ones in terms of public safety announcements for reducing risk of thermal runaways, to not leave your device on charge forever because the circuitry, if not well designed, may continue to charge the battery. So then what is thermal runaway? I love this chart. I had to stare at it for the first time for a while before I fully grasped what it's showing us. So I'll give you the short version, but what we're looking at is enthalpies of reaction versus temperature. So the amount of energy that's going to be released when a reaction occurs inside the battery. So there's a lot of chemicals inside the battery, just to sort of oversimplify there. And as the temperature increases, let's say you're in the Simpson Desert, if I have it right, and you've left your cell phone on your dashboard in the summer sun, and your cell phone reaches up to about 100 degrees Celsius, the solid electrolyte interphase, which is one of these, sort of chemical layers inside the battery, will decompose. So it's going to be exothermic and it's going to drive the temperature up. Fairly soon, there's a regeneration reaction which occurs, which generates more heat. And then if you have a polyethylene separator, this is endothermic, the polyethylene will melt. So it's going to absorb some energy, but then you risk having a short circuit. And the short essentially through the separator drives the cell to heat extremely quickly. So you just kind of go, you pass go, you go directly to jail, and your cell is instantly hot enough to have all of these chain reactions occurring where more heat is added and the cell heats up more. So in the end, what it is the cell is generating heat from these chemical reactions from the stored energy faster than it can be dissipated. That tends to vaporize the inside of the cell, making sort of like pyrolysis, but also not even necessarily decomposed, just vaporized components, like vaporizing the electrolyte. And then that's ejected, and we can see what happens from there. So let's take a look at what happens from there. This is the cell on the left. It's about to go into thermal runaway. We put that in an oven and heated it until essentially we just pushed it over that line where the first chemical reaction happens. And there'd been self-heating before you saw, but the cell gets, red hot and releases a bunch of white vapor. That is the pyrolysis and vaporized internal materials. And so 30% state of charge is a good number to think about because that's where ICAO, which is an airline organization, says it's safe to declare batteries for shipment as long as their state of charge is less than 30%, because they don't want to see 100%, which I'll show you now, which is same thermal runaway reaction, but because there's more stored electrical energy, you have a more violent discharge and a faster reaction. So that really drives thermal runaway propagation when you have more stored energy. So generally, state of charge makes things safer when you have less. Yeah, so lots to consider with state of charge, but just know that you're more likely going to have a faster reaction and more likely going to have ignition when you have a high state of charge. The batteries I showed you were an NCA, so nickel, cobalt, aluminum oxide. This is a bit older of a technology, but it's still very prolific. Things are moving towards lithium iron phosphate, or LFP. But what we find is that the mixture is flammable because even though it's about 30% CO2, it still tends to be about 30% hydrogen, 30% carbon monoxide. And then the balance tends to be hydrocarbons. This is an exact one from a particular cell, but the ratios often stay close. For lithium iron phosphate, you tend to see the same components, but more hydrogen is often released. So that means that it tends to be more reactive. So when we look at things like burning velocity, which are essential for doing explosion calculations, and maximum deflagration pressures, the chemistry that was on the left there, NCA, is on par with propane. So it's an explosion hazard. The lithium iron phosphate chemistries tend to be somewhere between ethylene and acetylene. So we often in our research use ethylene to kind of span the range in doing explosion experiments. The deflagration pressures are, just basically sort of all on par, nothing too unique there. So I mentioned heat can be a cause of thermal runaway. So when you have thermal runaway propagation, really what we're looking at is, yes, there are other causes of thermal runaway, but this is the one to focus on specifically in terms of trying to mitigate thermal runaway propagation. So this cell is being heated until it has thermal runaway. It generates heat from thermal runaway. It transfers that heat very quickly to the cells around it. They reach a point where maybe some outer part of the battery gets hot enough to have some of those chemical reactions, or maybe the separator melts immediately and they short, and then you get thermal runaway in those. So they call it cascading or propagating thermal runaway because it tends to almost always be heat as the source. You can find some, again, edge cases where there's interesting things with other propagation events, but it's 99.9% of the time in our industry it's heat. So some hazards develop from that propagation of thermal runaway and what happens. So there's a few variables that drive that. I'll skip non-hazardous thermal runaway. I've seen that in research a couple times, but what we're really looking at is an initial release of flammable gas followed by either a flaming hazard, a vented deflagration hazard, either if you're lucky or if you've designed proper containment, or an uncontained deflagration, which is just an explosion. So I won't suggest that we try to read this flowchart as it is here, but what this flowchart is a basically kind of like a maze you can follow and look at the conditions that you want to study. So what created this flowchart was we were performing a test 2018 timeframe, and it was a very big battery at the time. It's still a big battery, and we have a laboratory that's 100 feet by 100 feet, or about 30 meters by 30 meters, with a ceiling that's like 15 meters. And it's still an indoor building, but it was a big enough battery that we were concerned with the various hazards that could happen. The fire could get too big for the lab. We could have an explosion, which the lab is not designed for. So we wanted to be able to have a means to track what's happening in front of us as we observe the test and have pre-planned controls for how to respond if the fire's growing quickly and is going to exceed our threshold for safety, or if we think there's going to be an explosion hazard, how we preempt that and remove the hazard. And what drives it is, number one, whether the cell can have thermal runaway, and that's almost always yes with lithium-ion chemistries. Whether the battery, so that's an arrangement of cells, has propensity for thermal runaway propagation. And for tonight's purposes, let's say there's propensity. The industry's getting better at stopping thermal runaway propagation, but we're going to look at a lot of cases where it just propagates. And then there's ignition, whether the ignition is immediate and you have flaming right away, or you release flammable gas before that ignition occurs, whether the gas that's being released is confined. And at the end, there's always a concern about stranded energy, especially with newer, safer batteries that might not have propagation. So the whole battery is not damaged. You have to now worry about whether some of that heat energy has damaged the cells around it, and reignition is an issue. So this particular resource here is available at this link. It's also part of the battery course, but so you can kind of look at that as an engineering tool and say what's possible with this you know, box of batteries I'm looking at, or this electric vehicle in a parking garage if you wanted to do a risk analysis. So we'll look at flammable gas release. I mentioned that the cells release flammable gas. And so we'll say, well, does ignition occur? No. And then there's ongoing thermal runaway propagation. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here's the e-scooter, and there's propagating thermal runaway. It's going cell to cell. There is no ignition. And so we're just kind of saying this is really going to lead to the next hazardous scenario. There is a respiratory hazard here. There's active research to say what that is. The CO hazard is certainly very high, but really it's the fireball that results from that accumulation followed by ignition that's really driving the hazard here. So let's put it into perspective for the fire service. We ran some experiments for the Department of Energy here, the US Department of Energy, a few years ago, where we wanted to look at the video on the left here. There's no lithium-ion cells here. This is a vent limited fire. So we started a fire in normal combustible items in a simulated garage. We see all the telltale signs. We're simulating a saw cutting through the door now. That's what all the sparks are doing. And nothing spectacular happens because it's normal smoke. There is unburned hydrocarbons that are in the smoke, but they're fairly low in concentration, and they don't create the mixture that can ignite. So firefighters have gotten very used to, now we're saying, okay, we've punched a hole in and gained access. They know now that providing that ventilation can cause that fire to resurge because it's vent limited. But what's different is on the right, you just saw in the scooter video how we have some telltales for battery gas. The lower layer tends to hug the floor. It's like heavy vaporized electrolyte materials, the big hydrocarbons. But those telltale signs go away, like we see here on the right. So this is a underventilated fire with batteries added. And now all of a sudden, simulating the same firefighting tactics, the simulated saw operation ignites the smoke because there's more flammable components in that smoke. And as we pull that door open, the fire just immediately gets larger and larger. So it could represent an explosion hazard with the gas in confinement. And it can also represent a fast growing fire if the firefighters don't have a hose immediately available, anticipating that growth. Here's just another example. It's not always going to be as immediate. It really depends on the gas concentration. So we were trying to recreate an explosion here that had happened in the field. So we've, pulled this door open remotely with some cables and a winch. And this container was about 200 Celsius. And yet, so not really pre-flashover conditions, but because of the high concentration of gases from the batteries, we basically transitioned to flashover within about 20 seconds. So again, this is to the fire service looking to open these containers, which is, sort of ill-advised at this point. If they don't have water immediately available, to expect the fire to be very fast moving and change what their mental model, says should happen. This at training.fsri.org is actually, we have another module, which is our investigation into that incident and the driving factors. It's a little bit older of an energy storage system design. They're not really building them this way as much anymore. But if there's any, fire service members on the call, some of those are out there still operating. So it sort of behooves you to understand some of these dynamics. And the dynamics will still apply to the newer systems. It's just that, they won't be this particular construction. I mentioned the toxic exposure. We haven't seen very clear, notable incidents that have occurred because of the toxicity of batteries, other than some suspicious fire service exposures. But these are the gas concentrations where CO is red and CO2 is gray that were measured. These are the concentrations that were measured inside that container when we opened the door. So at that moment, there was 15,000 ppm of carbon monoxide. And the immediately dangerous to life and health concentration that we use in the United States is 1,200 ppm. So it's hard to say if you would fall down with a single breath of this. It's more complicated than that. but this is certainly a few breaths is going to become an enormous problem quickly. These other numbers are from some research that Dan Goddick ran in the 90s to look at the concentrations of CO and CO2 when different fuels were burned until a room became underventilated. So you can see that an underventilated thermal runaway incident can be generating a significantly more hazardous gas profile. So let's take a look at the flaming hazard. This really has to do with, so you do have propagation and you do have an ignition. The gas can be contained, but well, let's just say for this case, it's not contained. So this is a completely uncontained 50 pack of 18650 batteries. And you can see that the velocity of the gas ejecting from the cell under thermal runaway is, very impressive. This is 600 frames per second. And we're seeing jets form, very rapid propagation of thermal runaway, which results in a very fast fire growth. So even though this is slowed down, it's still relatively fast. And then things like cells being ejected, we do have a cage around it to prevent that from happening. But essentially, we don't really see this commonly in most fuels. So if I were to try and engineer my own fake residential energy storage system, and I didn't do a particularly good job, I'm admitting to that here. We were trying to do some research to demonstrate the types of hazards. So I'll be clear that I haven't seen a residential energy storage system behave like this. But if you've watched much YouTube and seen DIY battery packs made, this is our first foray into DIY energy storage. So you can tell we have very rapid thermal runaway propagation and delayed ignition. Once we get ignition, which is in just a second here, you can see that the feedback from the flames to the cells causes really, massively accelerated thermal runaway propagation, and things got a little exciting. So that was about 7 megawatts of fire in about 30 seconds. So fairly unprecedented. And, I need to temper that and say, probably most products aren't going to look like this. But here is a real world reality check of that actually happening. So this company is in Colorado. You're looking through the windshield of a battalion chief for the local fire department, and he had just driven past this vehicle. It was a company that was taking the gas powertrains off brand new box fans and replacing them with, in-house made battery packs that are like the saddle tanks that where the diesel would go in this type of truck. So uncommon, but not impossible, and certainly different. So let me, I'll actually skip through this one. We'll look at more cases of that. Essentially, the enclosure confines the gas and causes it to vent very violently in a specific direction. We can also see ejection of cells. So this can be an issue for firefighters in doing an overhaul, in finding all of where the cells have been ejected. I think I need to speed you up a little bit too. Yeah. So I'll wait till a couple of the cells eject. This is the first battery test we actually ever ran. So we learned the hard way about cells, landing inside our test equipment boxes while we filmed this for the local news. So come a long way, but pretty alarming first fire. But the idea is these can be secondary ignition sources. Stranded energy, I don't have great visuals for, but you know that if you've damaged a battery pack, lithium-ion cells self-discharge at a very slow rate. So the hazard persists for, in some cases, more than a year we've seen now. And it's occurred across all different types of products.
Too bad. Goodbye, dream. Okay, last objection, I swear, but that's actually supposed to go in a separate collection for e-waste, which is the last Friday of every month. It's fine.
Laptop. So Family Guy's doing our PSAs. We recognize society has formally recognized the problem. So I just like throwing that clip in there to keep you all awake. But so a quick foray into suppression. Are lithium batteries lithium metal fires? They are not. And here's the best possible scenario we can expect to see with a Class D extinguisher. So this is a copper-based agent, and we have direct access to the cells. They're in thermal runaway propagation. And this mechanism that's intended for smothering metal fires is really just pushing the gas around that's coming out of those cells. So I like to put that in here just because it's time to stop talking about Class D agents being useful on lithium-ion batteries. And what about other technologies? So here's a control in the top left, no extinguisher. And then ABC and carbon dioxide, you're going to see they have their mechanisms for effectiveness on the flames themselves. But the thing driving thermal runaway propagation is heat transfer. So the water getting directly on the cells is most effective. But you can see there was even some challenges because the heat is generated so quickly from the cells that it's very hard to remove it all as quickly as it's being generated. So the more exciting videos, vented deflagration. So in that container test series, this isn't all too exciting, but this is a single cell going to thermal runaway, a larger cell, and it's gas into this container. And the timing's random. We don't get to control this. We get an ignition of that, minor buildup of gas. And that led to the container doors. These are latched shut. So we didn't operate our pressure vents, but it still generated about a quarter of a PSI and then actually bent the mechanisms and forced the doors open. So a relatively small partial volume deflagration can still generate enough pressure that a quarter PSI over this area is actually thousands of pounds of force and can still cause damage. Full volume deflagration, really, it's the same thing. We're just saying you have a greater volume of gas. You can potentially fill an entire room depending on the type of battery or the size of battery that goes in thermal runaway. And that can lead to essentially just a larger explosion. It means also that if you have things like contactors or anything that's going to be arcing or sparking, a switch maybe, they can become the ignition source since the whole room can essentially at some point pass into the flammability range. So actually that in that video, you're seeing a more successful version of our mocked up energy storage system. We didn't control ignition. It just ignited on its own about 16 minutes after thermal runaway. So then explosion hazards. Explosion hazards are the same thing. The only thing that's different really here when I play this video is we designed this cabinet mock-up to be top venting, to say this is what a successful top venting energy storage system explosion should look like. And what happens is we have an ignition at the bottom. The flame propagates up through the top so quickly that even though the top vents, we generate enough pressure that we blew all the side panels off. So an explosion is just an unvented deflagration. You overcome the strength of the enclosure, and the enclosure itself likely becomes the biggest hazard as it comes apart. When that room filled up full of flammable gas, this is what that looked like. So safer in our lab because we engineered it that way, but still a relatively large hazard. And this, of course, has happened many times in the public as well. Not in an alarmingly high rate, but high enough that we need to start looking at where we're putting battery products when they get large enough to cause an explosion hazard, maybe relocating some of those to outside, or designating places for charging of e-bikes, things like that. So this is where it all ties together for us. We've been offering these slides for many years on the changing fire environment. I can speak mostly to the United States, but our homes have gotten, much, much larger at generally the same cost. The interior spaces have opened up, so we don't have as many small rooms, each room having a door. That means more, unabated fire spread from room to room. And we have a lot more upholstered furniture. Things like organics have gone away, synthetics have replaced them. Our structures are less structurally sound during fire events because the structural members are more lightweight, so they give into charring and ignition sooner. Their style of construction, things like gusset plates pull out of charred wood faster. and our homes have moved closer together. So a single home fire might be a two home fire by the time the fire service gets there. And then this just ties into our next slide of technologies now changing how homes burn. And let me start with just benchmarking this. You have a minute to see what you're looking at. This is grandmom's couch. It's probably a organic cotton upholstery. It may have horsehair inside. It may have cotton batting inside, but the fire's growing very slowly here. And you can see by about the 3-minute mark, the synthetic couch is a little more than half ignited. It's sort of pooling below as the couch melts, and we're up to 3 megawatts by the time we get to 4 minutes. And this is where we've said the timeline for escape from residential fires has massively changed. Now that we just rolled past the 6-minute mark in the United States, 6 minutes from the time of detection is about when the first fire truck's going to show up. And we've already probably driven this room to flashover. So watch the video in the top right and the plot here. This is going to be sped up, but you can compare the scary modern sofa versus the e-bike and see that battery thermal runaway gets us to a megawatt before the couch is even going. So that was 1 megawatt in 30 seconds. That fire drives the ignition of the second, e-bike fuel package, or I should say e-scooter fuel package, which was at about another megawatt peak. This is, on its way into decay before this couch is even half ignited. So that's changed the residential fire timeline. I would recommend you go to our webpage and look at some of the videos of that happening. I don't have time for it. So we wanted to look at how it would change things on a more challenging area of egress. So we burned 3 different size devices. 2 are policy compliant. This seated e-scooter is not. The batteries got bigger as we tested. And we forced them into the runaway to look at the development of smoke conditions. All we really know is travel time for egress studies in the United States. We don't know how long it takes people to recognize and respond and start moving. So if what we look at from the tests gives us a time benchmark, what we saw was there tends to be unignited gas venting from 2 to 90 seconds. People may not recognize that. And then there's end-to-end smoke development, and I'll show you a video of that occurred in 20 to 30 seconds, basically. Visibility was lost as soon as 2 minutes, and the median time for loss of visibility complete floor to ceiling was 3 minutes. And then our trains are mostly protected by heavily fire retarding the plastics, but the jets from the battery generally cause them to ignite anyway. It massively overwhelmed the fire retardant capacity of that material. And so here is, when this hits 130, you'll see this cloud of gas, which is hanging there and maybe worrying the people down this end. Should I evacuate? Now we have ignition. And in the next 20 seconds, we'll see smoke move from that far end all the way down to the end we're looking at here. And so it's reasonable to expect many people will at least be exposed to some amount of smoke before they eat it. So that will continue and involve some of the train car materials and eventually become event limited fire. But what we know about our egress times in the US during a well-designed study that wasn't necessarily considering fires is that at this level platform, if the train has not left the station, we're looking at about a minute and 40 seconds for people to all evacuate off. If the train has to let people off onto a right of way or this rocky gravel ballast, it'll take more like 4 minutes, 4.25 minutes. But those conditions are not with the train moving. They're not with smoke filling. They're not, with movement limited passengers. They're not with a lot of factors like people trying to grab their stuff and leave. So the times that we looked at for safe egress were fractional effective dose calculations. And so we saw if we're worried about the first person falling down, maybe 10% of the affected or the 10% of the exposed population will be compromised at a fractional effective dose at 0.3. That occurred as soon as 3.5 minutes in the worst fire or as long as 7 minutes. But we know if the train has to stop, that these times get much longer. Thermal FED, there was a high enough exposure in the area of the fire itself to incapacitate people within about 3 meters. But the train car in the window of time we looked at didn't get excessively hot, but it became filled with asphyxiant gases. So we have some recommendations, but I think I'll just skip most of them. They're around. Continue to monitor size, disallow DIY and modified products, require safety certifications, do passenger education, and use visual aids to make clear what's not allowable on passenger transport. Updating staff for railways on the severity of these new hazards, especially focusing on evacuating passengers from the train and not attempting firefighting, because the fires probably aren't controllable, as I showed you with the extinguisher versus battery pack videos, and may be fast growing. So it's more important to focus on getting people away. The train cars are less important than people's lives. So easy point for us to make there. And then start to work on railcar modifications that move the larger devices, the e-scooters, the e-bikes, away from people, maybe in a baggage car, but that's something being debated. So I can't share the name of that railway company. They would like to keep that private until they release the results, but at least talk about the nature of the work. So I chewed through some of your question time, but I wanted to stop there and see what questions you all have.
Thank you very much, Adam. Very informative and very interesting work, and excuse me, some videos you've done. So yeah, I'll just put it open to the floor. Feel free to post any questions you have here in the chat. Some of the videos are quite concerning to me, especially having seen items such as lithium-ion batteries and scooters and that within lifts and on railway cars as well. It's quite concerning. So if anyone has any questions for Adam, please feel free to ask them. I want to have a question. What was the battery makeup of the DIY wall pack that you had?
Oh, so actually we built that entirely by fabricating the steel enclosure, and we bought that's in our, I believe that's in our report. So that they're Panasonic cells, but you can really use just about any good, quality lithium-ion battery cell. It'll have, if it has energy storage capacity that you'd want, it will have a pretty severe thermal runaway. And so it'll propagate, depends on your definition, but nicely.
Yeah. We have a question from Jackie, which I can answer yes. We hope to put this recording on YouTube afterwards. Is there any way to actually stop thermal runaway? That's probably a question. All of these sort of things look at thermal runaway happening. Is there any way to stop it? Is it just a battery management system, or can you explain a bit more around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably where I see the fire safety industry butt heads most with the battery industry. At a fundamental level, it's probably not possible. It's probably unfeasible to stop thermal runaway in the initiating cell unless it's been engineered out. And there's some fancy technologies to do that, but they're not the type that you're going to see in products, because that means they're expensive. So if we assume the first cell is going to have thermal runaway, can you stop thermal runaway propagation? That answer is very definitely yes. It's better to have that designed in. So if you consider the lithium-ion batteries that are in satellites in space, those are really, really expensive. And so they'll sacrifice a little bit of energy density by separating the cells out and managing the gases that come out during thermal runaway. So think of the oven video. The gases that come out are hot and they are flammable. So if they can be routed away from the other cells, that stops some amount of heat transfer. And then the remaining energy that's there, I've heard it, described as about a third of the total energy release, just needs to be isolated so that you don't have cell to cell, radiative and convective heat transfer, maybe conductive if they're touching. That's done fairly easily. I know is an organization here that designed satellites down the road from me that has demonstrated a solution to this problem, but they lose about 25% of their energy density. So that could be feasible in something like a stationary energy storage system, but I think you won't see it for a while in cars because EV automakers, to overcome the hump of people being afraid of this limited range, they're trying, I know it in miles, the magic number for us is 290 miles. So if they have to reduce their energy storage capacity by 25%, they're less inclined to do it. So now if we talk about, can it be mitigated by reactive things that fire protection engineers design, it's a lot harder and there's a lot of debate over it. Water is the most effective thing we've used in the laboratory for control. And in things like the Moss Landing fire, there's a significant and reasonable argument that while water can control the heat transfer from the cells and propagation, getting a lot of electrical equipment wet that's going to short may lead to and has led to reignitions and more severe events. So it's much harder for fire protection engineers. I think that's where the development of codes and standards really needs to kind of hit it where the products are designed before they get installed in our environments. And I see there's another question in the chat now too. Yeah. So is there any advice for individuals other than not overcharging, not exposing them to impact? I skipped the take charge of battery safety PSA that we put out, and you'll find similar from other organizations, but we've tried to make ours pretty comprehensive. Yeah, as you mentioned, things like not leaving your batteries on charge is a good idea. Also, not mismatching chargers. So there was actually, yeah. So most of the e-bike fires that occurred in New York City, if someone say needed this, e-bike for their gig job so that they can, deliver food all day, they want to charge their batteries faster. So they might buy a charger that charges faster but is not matched to the battery. That might overcharge it or overstress it. That has led to plenty of incidents, but also things like there's a major brand of stick vacuum that makes a pretty expensive battery, but it's also certified. It means it's been tested for safety. So that's a good thing to do, is look for battery safety certifications on your products. But if you're replacing a battery and you find, say, a $30 version of that $100 battery on major-online-retailer.com, it may be that battery hasn't had the rigorous safety design. It doesn't use cells that are built with the same quality. So those things can certainly affect frequency. I can't say the stick vacuum brand, but I don't know. Rhymes with Schmeisen, I guess. Don't replace the brand itself, quality product. It's the knockoff batteries that are really the replacement batteries that are the problem.
There was a question previous to that, and we actually had a high-speed camera set up in our lab for one day, unfortunately. But I just want to know, through your videos, were you able to analyze any discharge velocities from your batteries? What sort of velocities are we talking about?
We argued about whether we should do that recently, and we haven't. And I'm trying to recall the source because it was maybe within the last month that I heard a number quoted that some of the ejection velocities can be supersonic, and I'm not sure about it. I think it's possible. It's certainly very high, and we've just acquired a new high speed camera that we could do this measurements with, but I can't honestly say. It certainly can overwhelm the burning velocity of the gases, because sometimes you actually see these things self-extinguish because the gas ejection velocity is so high that it'll just lift the flame right off. It's kind of wild when you see that, actually.
Oh, and I guess for yourself, where do you see the next couple of years of research focusing on? Where do you see the emerging hazards from this, and which direction are you heading?
Well, I think there are some new there's new attention to some challenges that have been existing, like transportation of batteries on ships. So car carriers are uniquely challenged in that the frequency is not very high, but the consequences are completely catastrophic. So um, there's a lot of need to engineer a solution for the unlikely event that there's a large incident on a car carrier. I think there's been maybe 3 fires now in car carriers, 2 of them being catastrophic. Um, but our research will continue in electric vehicles because it is sort of it's for us, it's a place to develop a lot of knowledge for the fire service, which will help the public become more comfortable with electric vehicle fires. It'll help the fire service understand, how much of a new hazard they are. But in general, we're learning more about the effluent that comes out of the batteries to help understand if it's meaningfully different. So I'm being very careful with my words there. We've seen some different chemical exposure health hazards, but we're actively working on determining if it means something. No one really knows if it means something yet, but there's fluoride particulates that are in higher concentration. There's metal particulates that are in much higher concentration, but the toxicology of that is not clear yet. Oh, here's a good question, actually. Age is a little hard to tell. So it's not really like a yes or no answer. Um, I suspect, this is my speculation, that aged batteries are probably less hazardous. The asterisk to that is if you've got something that you've charged in the cold a lot, maybe not an Australian issue, but our northern states, you can make the battery less stable by doing that. You can also form dendrites if you do that, or with some batteries, so they can become less stable. But generally, if aging is kind of like the cycle life is long, um, and you reduce capacity, it's kind of like reducing the state of charge. So it's a little bit of a mixed answer. If you've got something around and you're not using it and it's old, just get rid of it. I mean, that's really the best answer. And then I see another one here. Some occupants in residential building rely on mobility scooters for medical purposes. Um, would it be prudent to permit lead acid batteries and prohibit lithium ion? That's a tough question. I would say that yeah, lead acid is going to be less risk. Your risk should be very low. Where I've looked at this is mobility scooters being allowed on aircraft. They have a maximum battery size, but the ability for airline companies to strictly regulate that is kind of challenged. So just as you could bring in a massive battery bank on, and it's questionable it's going to get caught. So yeah, there is kind of a risk with that. And where I'm hoping we see some changes in codes and standards, maybe requiring areas for storage and charging, and where we have just recently issued a standard on those charging cabinets. So there are containment devices that can be used to help try to contain that when it's not immediately in use. But yeah, that's it would have to be, I think, part of a risk analysis to say if this mobility device is, say, in a retirement home and everyone's mobility challenged and the fire can develop faster, I think it needs to be part of the overall look at risk and how that's managed rather than just focusing particularly on the device. Maybe looking at other egress strategies or fire protection strategies. We did find in a paper that's going to come out that we were able to control the e-scooter fire to prevent the room from flashing over with our standard residential sprinklers. So that was a very promising result that may help with that issue. So sorry for the long answer there. It seems the explosion is more critical in ESS system. Could I share any experience on restriction of maximum capacity of ESS in one fire compartment? I don't think I've seen much luck in restricting the maximum battery size in a compartment to control an explosion hazard. The reason for that is if you look at the residential explosion research on our webpage that we did a few years ago, we've correlated damage to a building based on battery size. And so we, in our United States 2-car garage, so something like a 4 meters by 4 meters space with a battery about the size of an e-bike battery, we're able to generate enough pressure to eject the garage door. So small battery, big space. There are some numbers in research that the batteries tend to release around 7/10 of a liter per watt hour of flammable gas. And so you could look at the watt hours and look at the flammability of that gas mixture and determine when you have an explosion hazard. So I'd say it's probably better to have a very small volume available and to move through that flammability region very quickly and to manage the venting of that gas to outside the compartment. That is actually a very hotly debated and controversial question in code development right now. That's a hard one. Good question.
Final question from me. How does all this change if you're on an airplane? Is there any plans to do any research?
Yeah, I mean, air carriers have done what they can do. They've pulled all the levers they can outright, other than outright banning batteries, which really isn't possible. So I suspect what's happening there is that the batteries do tend to be small. You're not having e-bikes brought on board. So as long as the thermal runaway is relatively short because the battery's small and the fire is successfully controlled by the cabin crew with things like bottles of water, which tends to happen, what happens is you have a really irritant smoke exposure and everyone's unhappy. The incident rate right now that we know of from some of my colleagues that collect this data is there's about 2 incidents a week. I want to say that's in the US, not the whole world. So it happens often, but it doesn't tend to transition to a larger fire. The Air Busan incident, if any of you are familiar, happened fairly recently. And it's not known what battery size that was, but it was in luggage in the overhead. And so that had overwhelmed the fire retardant materials in the plastics in the overhead and transitioned to a fuselage fire. Fortunately, that jet had not taken off yet and everyone evacuated safely. But it is a wake-up call to say that we don't really know what size battery, threshold there would be. How small is small enough that you don't have another Air Busan? I'm not sure there's an answer there yet. But I know the airline industry is conducting research to, figure out how to better mitigate that particular type of incident.
Excellent. Well, it looks like we're out of time and also out of questions. So I'd like to thank you, Adam, very much for your presentation today. I know it's starting to get late where you are, so yeah, we really appreciate it. And for anyone online, Adam's email is on the screen if you wish to contact him. So thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you all. And I hope this helps you with your careers in school. So good luck and stay in touch.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to Adam. See you next time.
Bye-bye.